This morning, a defiant defense of his attorney general. President Trump calling Jeff Sessions an honest man after the revelation Sessions, as a senator, spoke with the Russian ambassador, but didn't disclose it at his confirmation hearing when asked about campaign contacts.
I have been called a surrogate at a time or two in that campaign, and I did not have communications with the Russians.
Now?
Retrospect, if I should have slowed down and said, but I did meet one Russian official a couple of times.
The president, in a statement, says Sessions could have stated his response more accurately, but it was clearly not intentional. Then, blaming Democrats. Quote, they lost the election and now they have lost their grip on reality.
Once again, some big news. You think we're going to be talking all this week about the president's speech. Then yesterday morning, I got the sense we were going to be spending the next few days talking about an administration stonewalling and not getting it. Now, of course, Jeff Sessions moves out pretty quickly and follows the advice a lot of us had around the set, which is get out there, recuse yourself, try to get that part of the story behind us. But as we're saying, still a lot of unanswered questions.
So, Joe, Attorney General Sessions gave that answer last night to Tucker. He also said during his press conference yesterday that he answered the question the way he did to Senator Franken because he was taken aback by the news. And in hindsight, he should have said, well, I did have these 2 meetings with the Russian ambassador.
Yeah, it's John Heilman. Some people were looking at the press conference yesterday, thought he did a pretty good job considering the tough circumstances that I spoke with that are actually critics of the administration. But there's still too many, for me, there's just still too many tough questions about how you don't answer that question with a simple yes, I have. That's what I just don't get that, and I haven't heard anything to really explain that.
I totally agree. I mean, his performance yesterday, if I had been advising him as his attorney, and I'm not an attorney, but if I were, I would have advised him not to give that performance at all, given that perjury is still a question for him, and he raised a lot of questions with this performance yesterday, including saying he didn't remember a whole bunch of things, which is a standard thing for people to do in legal situations like this, but saying he remembered the details of various exchanges that he had with the Russian ambassador, just not the ones that are currently at issue related to the campaign. He talked about a trip that he'd taken to the Soviet Union in the past and an exchange they had about people of faith who came to the Soviet Union, so on. Look, I think again, given the timing of the meetings, given that he traveled, we now know, to the Republican convention in Cleveland on campaign money, not on Senate office money. That's in the news this morning. Given that the second meeting took place when the question of Russian hacking was so much in the news, the notion that he met with the Russian ambassador, and we also know that one of the things he spoke about at the Cleveland convention, at the event where the Russian ambassador was present, was the campaign. So there are a lot of questions here, and there's a lot about his press conference yesterday that I think raise more questions than they answer, and don't at all ring to a normal person listening to this, remembering the circumstances, remembering the timing. There's an awful lot about the things that Jeff Sessions said yesterday that just do not ring true.
Well, on the legal threshold for perjury, that is probably his best piece of this because, as you know from being in Congress, while this is often raised, actual indictable action based on a misstatement or even falsehood to Congress is relatively rare. It's a high bar. It's meaningful or willful deceit. That is why even before he made the news of saying he would recuse, at the very top of the presser yesterday, he said, well, he certainly didn't mean to. He certainly didn't intend to deceive. In other words, okay, even if I said something that wasn't true, I didn't mean that, and that's a kind of a proactive defense to perjury. So just because that's a high bar, Joe, that's probably an area where legally he is in less jeopardy, although this all looks bad. Having said that, then you have the other layers here. You have what happened with Russia during the campaign, still a big question. Then you have why did you say things that now don't add up? Were they false at the time or memory problems? That's the point you were just raising, Joe. And then third, the heart of this matter, what is the legal process and independence? And that goes to another important headline here, a lot of headlines this morning. What jumped out in the Fox News interview was basically the Attorney General saying, hey, I'm going to recuse myself from anything up to Election Day, but not necessarily after. Here's what he said last night.
Does your recusal extend to, say, an investigation into the leaks that led to the departure of General Flynn?
These things have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. Anytime anything comes up connected to the campaign, I would be recused because I've made that clear. If something else comes up that's not related to the campaign, we would go through the same process as I committed to the Senate, and that I have done, and that is to see if there's a reason I should not be involved in the case.
Right.
So I think I've performed exactly correctly for an Attorney General of the United States.
The key headline there being, Joe, that is the Attorney General saying he's stepping aside, but only up to Election Day. Now, let's not prejudge. I'm not saying we know whether there was malfeasance or not. We don't. But we certainly do know that the FBI was talking to General Flynn and others about activities after Election Day. So he made a big point of going independent yesterday, then does an interview within hours saying, but I'm not independent as to all these other things the FBI is looking at.
And more reports this morning of meetings of other Trump campaign people meeting with the same ambassador.
Mr. President, do you still have confidence in the Attorney General, sir?
Total. Should Sessions recuse himself from investigations into your campaign in Russia?
I don't think so at all.
When did you first learn that Sessions spoke to the Russian ambassador? Did you know during the campaign? When were you aware that he spoke to the Russian ambassador?
I wasn't aware of that.
When did you find out?
You should have spoken truthfully about whether he had spoken to the ambassador.
What in the world could explain a man as smart as Jeff Sessions, who can remember trips to Moscow and can remember things that happened back in 1986 in hearings and can remember the finite details of conversations he had when he was or wasn't telling a joke in 1981 or 82 or 83. He can recall things in his testimony that he did and did not say from 40 years ago. And yet he doesn't remember a conversation with the Russian ambassador, which was unusual in the first place. I can tell you that as a member of the House Armed Services Committee. We didn't have ambassadors meeting us. That was what the foreign affairs guys and women did. But he can't remember that unusual meeting when the issue of Russia is on the front pages of every newspaper, them trying to hack and impact our election. Explain. Is there any explanation to that?
I cannot think of one that seems plausible, especially in this context, right? You know, we've had reporting in the last 24 hours about the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. As far as I know, at this moment, there's not a single one, except for, I think, Claire McCaskill, who met with the Russian ambassador once. I don't think there's anyone else in the Senate Armed Services Committee, including John McCain, who've met with the Russian ambassador, right? So here's the circumstance when the first meeting took place. The Russian ambassador is at the Republican convention. He's meeting with Jeff Sessions, who was the first United States senator to endorse Donald Trump. One of Donald Trump's most prominent spokespeople, surrogates, backers. For a long time, the only member of the United States Senate who was with Donald Trump. Those circumstances, the idea that the reason that the Russian ambassador was going to meet with Jeff Sessions was to discuss anything other than Donald Trump's campaign, the prospect that Donald Trump might become president of the United States, political matters. It just does not ring remotely true that there's a plausible alternative explanation. Again, given all the facts, given the timing, given all the circumstances. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I can't think of an argument for how any of this makes sense other than that there's at least, at a minimum, a shading of the truth on Sessions' part and possibly something much worse.
So, Ari, as you look at this right before we go to break here, is there trouble still ahead for Jeff Sessions? Was the recusal enough for him to step away from this Russia story?
Well, it's a partial recusal, so it's hard to see how a partial recusal solves all of the problems. I mean, it's incredible if you just take a step back and remember, as Joe was pointing out, the big questions are whether this election was on the level and whether a foreign adversary was trying to interfere. And that doesn't mean they succeeded, and it doesn't mean that everyone that might have benefited from that was in on it. But those are big, meaty questions for this government, for this administration to get to the bottom of. And rather than making any effort to do that, they seem to be catching up with disclosure disclosures when they come out from the independent press, when they come out from members of Congress and pressure or leaks from the FBI or elsewhere, then they catch up and try to answer it. And then the answer is, well, because of this big problem, we're going to recuse half of the issues. It's not a secret or a unknown thing that the FBI was investigating what Flynn did during the transition. That is post-campaign, that is post the recusal as it's been defined. And remember, again, we always speak fairly. Folks are innocent until proven guilty. The FBI has not done anything to suggest crimes were committed. But the FBI does not investigate bad judgment. They do not investigate mistakes. They investigate potential federal crimes, and they were doing that during the transition period. And on the Attorney General's own statement, he is not recusing himself from that.
You would say you only know a fraction of what the FBI knows here.
Oh, I would say at this point we know less than a fraction of what the FBI knows.
Congressman Adam Schiff today speaking moments after a long meeting with FBI Director James Comey. Joining us now is Congressman Schiff. He's the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Thank you for being here tonight, sir.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So I don't know enough about how intelligence committees work to know how much the FBI should be cooperating with you. Obviously, the FBI is in the Department of Justice. They are reportedly doing their own investigations into contacts between Trump folks and Russia. Obviously, the House and Senate Intelligence Committees are doing a legislative branch investigation as well. How much help do you expect to be getting from the FBI?
Well, there are really two ways the FBI is supposed to be communicating with us on this. The first is in the Gang of Eight, the select members of House and Senate that work on these issues. And we're supposed to get a quarterly counterintelligence briefing where the FBI sits down with us and says, these are the cases we're looking at, these are the investigations we're doing, you need to know about these are of national significance. That hasn't happened. Hasn't happened in the past, isn't happening now. Not on, I think, what the most significant potential counterintelligence investigation of the modern era. More than that, when the Intelligence Committee is doing an investigation, and here on a bipartisan basis, we've agreed to do this investigation. We have a detailed scope of investigation now that's been signed by the chairman and I. We bring the director in, we're doing our work, we're asking pertinent questions about that investigation, and the answers we got today from the director were, I won't answer that, I won't answer that, I won't answer that. And
to be clear, this is speaking in a closed setting. This is not like there are reporters there and they don't want this to leak. This is behind closed doors.
Oh, absolutely. Closed session and a hearing on the subject of the investigation.
What's the basis for saying no to you?
Well, I don't want to characterize the director's response, but I did endeavor to find out, is this his position? Is this a position dictated by the Department of Justice? And I have to say, I couldn't clearly establish what part of this was the director's decision, what part of this is operating on the department's decision or his interpretation of the department's decision. It wasn't very clear. But what was clear is we can't do our job if that's going to be the FBI's position.
You know, I'm a little bit less worried about this than those Democratic leaders are. And that's partly because I've covered Jim Comey for years, and he's very self-righteous. He likes to think of himself as this great crusader. Not necessarily a good thing as FBI director. I said that when he was confirmed under the Obama administration, but Democrats at that point thought he was, you know, he was pure and great. The Hillary investigation was public. Congress was involved in it. Yes, it was leaking like a sieve. And you know, what Jim Comey did last July and follow up in October was completely inappropriate. You know, don't get me wrong. That was the unusual thing. But I think it should be treated differently from an ongoing counterintelligence investigation. I mean, there are people who, for example, might be sources named in the dossier that Christopher Steele, a former MI6 agent who this dossier got leaked by BuzzFeed in January. There are people who might be sources in that who have since died in suspect circumstances. Four actually, Russians have been charged with treason with allegations that they're tied to this investigation. The reason you don't want a counterintelligence investigation to be shared with a Congress that is obviously leaking is because stuff like that, I mean, not only can the targets of the investigation find out and work to undercut the investigation, but people can get killed or charged with treason, and that's not going to help us get to the bottom of this. So, you know, Pelosi, Schiff are absolutely right to be furious at Comey for what he did against Hillary Clinton last year. I'm not excusing that at all. But they should at least take a step back and think about whether they want the FBI investigation to be successful or whether they want it to be politically damaging, because those may be two different things.
Set aside the hacking of the election. When it comes to Donald Trump's business interests and this whole question of, is he invested in Russia? Is there something we should understand why he's so favorable to Vladimir Putin? That the question is really, do they have something invested in his projects everywhere from Trump Soho to his buildings when he couldn't get, credit extended from banks because he had declared bankruptcy so many times and had so much financial problems that the oligarchs supported him, and deep concern about what his financial obligations are to them, and how this fits into this bigger story of him not releasing his tax returns and not being transparent, why people are so concerned, separate from the question of whether Russia hacked the elections.
Right. I think that is something people should, and they're distinct issues, as you pointed out, and people should remember that they're distinct issues. Because what we're talking about with those business concerns, and it's not just Russia. Again, this is an area where we should have as many questions about China, if not more so, than Russia. Although some of his closest associates, you talked about the Soho project, are tied to Russia and do have ties to the mob. And that is a very fair question that we should be able to get answers to. Does he have relationships with people who have some kind of sway over him, over Trump, the brand? And if so, is that going to lead him to make decisions that he otherwise might not make? But, the other thing to remember is Trump is, sort of authoritarian. He is culturally very similar to oligarchs, whether they're Russian or Chinese or what have you. And we need to distinguish those two things. The shady business deals, definitely worth interrogation. Is the fact that he is culturally authoritarian and racist and so on and so forth, those are all things that were true before Russia hacked the election, for example. So it just takes some nuance, I think, to remember what we really should be able to get answers on, need to be able to get answers on, and those things which are Donald Trump being Donald Trump and being kind of straight up about who he is and who voters, for better or worse, elected in November.